You pull over what looks like a drug dealer's car at 2 a.m. Tinted windows. Temporary tags. Driver won't roll down the window all the way. You smell what might be marijuana. You order her out. She's refusing. Getting loud. Acting like she's somebody important. You're thinking another sovereign citizen video for the department's idiots we deal with file. Then she says 5 words that should make you stop everything. I'm a federal district judge. You laugh. Because the woman standing in front of you in sweatpants and a college hoodie, with her hair in a messy bun, definitely doesn't look like any judge you've ever seen. And that laugh, that 3-second moment of dismissive contempt, is about to cost you everything. That's exactly what happened to Sergeant Marcus Webb of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department at 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday morning in November. And what he didn't know was that the woman he was about to arrest had just spent 6 hours at her mother's deathbed, watching pancreatic cancer steal the last breaths from the only parent she had left. Her phone was dead. Her federal credentials were in her chambers 40 miles away. And she was driving her mother's 1997 Honda Civic with expired registration because her own car had broken down that afternoon. If you're ready to see how one moment of prejudice triggered a legal earthquake that would reshape an entire county's law enforcement, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now because you won't want to miss tomorrow's story of people who messed with the absolute wrong person and paid the ultimate price. Now let's see how a decorated federal judge ended up in handcuffs at a gas station, and how Sergeant Webb ended up losing everything he'd spent 20 years building. Judge Diane Morrison was 51 years old. She had graduated summa cum laude from Howard University, earned her law degree from Yale, and spent 15 years as a prosecutor before her appointment to the federal bench. She had presided over RICO cases that dismantled organized crime families. She had sentenced domestic terrorists. She had issued rulings that set precedent in 3 circuit courts. Her decisions had been cited in Supreme Court opinions. Twice. On this particular Thursday, November 9th, none of that mattered. What mattered was that at 7:43 p.m. her mother's oncologist had called with words that turned her world into fragments. You should come now. It's time. Diane had been in the middle of reviewing sentencing guidelines for a human trafficking case. She had closed her laptop without saving, grabbed her purse, told her clerk to cancel everything for the next week, and driven straight to Mercy General Hospital, breaking the speed limit the entire way, praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in that she wouldn't be too late. He made it. Barely. Her mother, Ruth Morrison, had been a school teacher for 37 years. She had raised Diane alone after Diane's father left when she was 3. She had worked 2 jobs to pay for piano lessons and debate club and SAT prep courses. She had sat in the front row at every academic achievement ceremony, every moot court competition, every bar admission ceremony. She had cried with pride when her daughter was confirmed as a federal judge, telling everyone in her church that she always knew her baby would change the world. Now Ruth lay in a hospital bed, her 73-year-old body reduced to bones and translucent skin, eyes clouded with morphine, breath coming in wet, rattling gasps that sounded like drowning. Diane held her mother's hand. The skin felt like tissue paper, fragile enough to tear. She told stories Ruth couldn't respond to. About cases she'd decided. About the new garden she was planning. About anything and everything except the obvious truth that this was goodbye. At 1:52 a.m., Ruth's breathing changed. The gaps between breaths stretched longer. Her grip on Diane's hand weakened, then released entirely. At 1:58 a.m., the heart monitor's steady beep flattened into a single continuous tone that would echo in Diane's nightmares for months. The nurse came in, checked for a pulse that wasn't there, noted the time with practiced efficiency, offered condolences that sounded genuine but rehearsed, asked if Diane needed anything. What Diane needed was her mother back. What she got was paperwork. She signed forms, made preliminary arrangements with the funeral director who appeared with unsettling speed, answered questions about organ donation and autopsy and whether Ruth had prepaid for cremation services. Each question felt like a violation, reducing her mother's life to check boxes and signatures. By 2:10 a.m., Diane was walking out of Mercy General in a daze. She had been at the hospital for 6 hours and 18 minutes. She hadn't eaten since lunch, hadn't had water since she arrived. Her phone had died somewhere around midnight. She walked to the parking lot on autopilot, keys in hand, trying to remember where she'd parked. Then she remembered. She hadn't driven her own car. Her 2023 Mercedes had broken down that afternoon. Alternator failure, the mechanic said, would take 2 days to get the part. So she'd taken her mother's car. The 1997 Honda Civic that Ruth had refused to replace despite Diane offering to buy her something newer, safer, more reliable. Ruth had loved that car. Said it reminded her of the year Diane graduated from law school, the year everything became possible. The Civic sat in the far corner of the lot. Faded blue paint. Dent in the rear bumper from when Ruth had backed into a shopping cart. Air freshener shaped like a pine tree hanging from the rearview mirror. Diane sat in the driver's seat and the smell hit her. Her mother's perfume, faint but unmistakable. She broke then. Sobbed until her throat was raw, until her eyes burned, until she had nothing left. At 2:14 a.m. she wiped her face with the sleeve of the Northwestern hoodie she'd grabbed from her office that afternoon. Started the engine. And began the drive home. She made it exactly 3 miles. Sergeant Marcus Webb had been a cop for 22 years. He'd started as a patrol officer fresh out of the academy, eager and idealistic and convinced he was going to make a difference. 22 years had sanded most of that idealism away, leaving behind a kind of cynical competence that he told himself was realistic rather than bitter. He'd made sergeant 8 years ago. Passed over for lieutenant twice, which his captain said was about budget constraints and department politics, but Webb suspected had more to do with the excessive force complaint from 2019 that had been ruled unfounded, but still sat in his file like a stain that wouldn't wash out. Tonight he was working the graveyard shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., patrolling the stretch of Highway 74 that cut through Riverside County. It was boring work. Most nights were quiet. A few speeders. Maybe a drunk driver if he was unlucky. Mostly he just drove around, watched Netflix on his phone during breaks and counted down the hours until his shift ended. At 2:16 a.m. he was parked behind a closed gas station, finishing a podcast about true crime, when he saw the Honda Civic roll past. Old car. Tinted windows darker than the legal limit. Temporary registration tag in the rear window that looked like it might be expired. Hard to tell from this angle, but something about it seemed off. Webb pulled out behind the Civic. Ran the plate through his dashboard computer. The registration came back to a Ruth Morrison, age 73, address in Riverside. The tag was expired. 47 days expired actually, which suggested either the owner was elderly and forgetful, or this was a stolen vehicle someone was driving on old paperwork hoping not to get caught. He hit his lights. The Civic didn't pull over immediately. It continued for another 100 yards, turn signal blinking, before finally pulling into the parking lot of a 24-hour convenience store. Webb noted the delay. Could mean the driver was looking for a safe, well-lit location. Could also mean the driver was hiding something, buying time to stash contraband or prepare a story. Webb approached from the driver's side, flashlight in his left hand, right hand resting on his service weapon. Standard procedure. The window was tinted dark enough that he couldn't see inside clearly. He tapped on the glass with the flashlight. The window rolled down about 4 inches. No more. A black woman stared out at him. Mid-40s, maybe 50s. Wearing a college hoodie and sweatpants. Hair pulled back in a messy bun. Eyes red and swollen like she'd been crying. No makeup. She looked exhausted, defensive, and distinctly unimpressed by his presence. Webb's first thought, drug user. The red eyes, the defensive posture, the refusal to roll the window down all the way, classic signs of someone who was high or carrying. His second thought, definitely not the registered owner. The registration belonged to a 73-year-old woman. This person was decades too young. License and registration, Webb said. His tone was flat, professional, giving nothing away. The woman didn't move. Why was I stopped, officer? Webb felt irritation spike in his chest. He'd been doing this job long enough to recognize the tone. Confrontational. Challenging his authority. The kind of person who'd watched too many YouTube videos about constitutional rights and thought they could talk their way out of a traffic stop. Expired registration, he said. License and registration. Now. The registration belongs to my mother, the woman said. Her voice was hoarse, like she'd been screaming or crying for hours. She passed away tonight. I was driving her car home from the hospital. Webb processed this. Could be true. Could also be complete bullshit. People lied to cops every single day. They lied about where they were going, what they were doing, whether they'd been drinking, whether the drugs in their pocket belonged to them or their friend. They lied with tears in their eyes and conviction in their voices and swore on their children's lives that they were telling the truth. He'd learned to trust exactly none of it. "Sorry for your loss," he said, the words automatic and meaningless. "I still need to see your license and registration." The woman stared at him for a long moment. Then she reached slowly toward the passenger seat. Webb's hand tightened on his weapon. He watched her every movement, tracking her hands, looking for any sudden motion that might signal a threat. She picked up a purse, leather, expensive looking, which seemed inconsistent with the beat-up Honda and the sweatpants. She opened it, pulled out a wallet, extracted a driver's license and handed it through the 4-inch gap in the window. Webb examined the license under his flashlight. California ID. Name, Diane Ruth Morrison. Age, 51. Address in Riverside, about 15 miles from here. The photo matched the woman in front of him. Nothing obviously suspicious. "And the registration," he said. "It's in the glove compartment," Diane said. "I need to reach across to get it." "Go ahead." Slowly. She leaned across the center console, popped open the glove compartment, and pulled out a registration document in a clear plastic sleeve. Handed it through the window. "Ruth Morrison. 1997 Honda Civic. Registration expired October 23rd. 47 days ago." "You know this registration is expired," Webb said. "I know," Diane said. Her voice had an edge now, sharp with exhaustion and grief and something else Webb couldn't quite identify. "My mother died 6 hours ago. I haven't had time to transfer the title or update the registration. I was at the hospital all night. My phone is dead. I just want to go home." Webb heard the words, processed them, decided he didn't believe them. Because here's what he saw. A middle-aged black woman driving a beat-up car with expired tags at 2 a.m., giving him attitude, refusing to roll her window down all the way, with red eyes that could easily be from marijuana or methamphetamine rather than grief. The expensive purse suggested money from somewhere. The defensive attitude suggested something to hide. In his experience, people who had nothing to hide cooperated fully. They rolled their windows all the way down. They turned on their interior lights. They kept their hands visible and their tone respectful. They certainly didn't question why they were being stopped or lecture him about what they'd been through. "Step out of the vehicle," Webb said. Diane's expression changed. The exhaustion gave way to something harder, more alert. "Why?" "Because I'm asking you to. That's not a legal reason for." "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask again. Step out of the vehicle or I'll remove you myself." There was a pause. Webb could see her thinking, calculating, deciding how far she wanted to push this. Finally, she opened the door and stepped out. She was taller than he expected. 5'9", maybe 5'10". The hoodie hung loose on her frame, the sweatpants wrinkled like she'd slept in them. She stood with her arms at her sides, deliberately non-threatening, but her posture was rigid with barely controlled anger. "Turn around," Webb said. "Hands on the vehicle." "You're searching me?" "Standard procedure for an expired registration stop." "That is absolutely not standard procedure and you know it." Webb felt his jaw tighten. This woman was really starting to piss him off. "Turn around. Hands on the vehicle. Now." Diane didn't move. When she spoke, her voice had changed completely. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by something cold and precise and absolutely controlled. "My name is Diane Ruth Morrison. I am a United States District Judge for the Central District of California. I was appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate 4 years ago. My chambers are at the Edward R. Roybal Federal Building in Los Angeles. My federal credentials are in my office because I drove to the hospital in my mother's car when her oncologist called to tell me she was dying. My mother passed away at 1:58 a.m. I have committed no crime. This stop is unlawful. You have no probable cause to search my person or my vehicle. And if you proceed, every action you take from this moment forward will be documented and used against you in federal court." Webb stared at her, processed the words, and then he did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He laughed. Not a chuckle. Not a skeptical snort. A full, dismissive laugh that said exactly what he thought about her claim. "A federal judge," he said. "Right. And I'm the Attorney General. Turn around." Hands on the vehicle. I'm not joking, Diane said. Her voice was absolutely level. Call the federal courthouse. Ask for the duty marshal. They can verify my identity in under 60 seconds. Turn around. Call the courthouse. Last warning. Diane stood perfectly still. Her eyes locked on his. And in that moment Webb saw something that should have made him stop, should have made him think, should have made him at least consider the possibility that she was telling the truth. He saw absolute certainty. Not the bravado of someone bluffing. Not the desperation of someone lying. Just calm, cold, unwavering certainty that she was exactly who she said she was, and he was making a catastrophic mistake. He ignored it. That's it, Webb said. He grabbed her arm, spun her around with more force than was necessary and pushed her against the Honda. Hands on the vehicle. You're under arrest for obstruction. What Webb didn't know, what he couldn't have known because he'd spent exactly 0 seconds actually listening to the woman he was arresting, was that Diane Morrison had been a federal judge for 4 years and 3 months. She had presided over 847 cases. She had issued 2,309 written opinions. She had sentenced 143 defendants to federal prison. She had granted preliminary injunctions that had stopped corporate mergers worth billions of dollars. She had sealed indictments against sitting politicians, organized crime figures, and the kind of white-collar criminals whose lawyers cost more per hour than most people earned in a week. 6 months earlier she had presided over the trial of United States versus Riverside County Sheriff's Department, a pattern and practice civil rights lawsuit brought by the Department of Justice. The case had alleged systematic racial profiling, excessive force, and deliberate indifference to constitutional violations. Diane had ruled in favor of the DOJ on 17 of 19 counts. She had imposed a consent decree requiring comprehensive reforms. Mandatory body cameras, independent oversight, bias training, and quarterly reporting to the court on stop-and-search data broken down by race. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department had appealed. The Ninth Circuit had upheld her ruling in its entirety. The Supreme Court had denied cert. The consent decree was now federal law, binding on every deputy in the county, including Sergeant Marcus Webb, who was currently handcuffing the judge who had authored that decree, while she stood in a gas station parking lot at 2:30 a.m., wearing her dead mother's Northwestern hoodie, too exhausted and grief-stricken to fight back. The handcuffs clicked shut. Webb tightened them more than necessary, metal biting into her wrists hard enough to leave marks. Diane didn't react. She stood perfectly still, breathing slowly and evenly, her legal mind already cataloging every detail with the precision that had made her one of the most meticulous judges in the Central District. Time, 2:31 a.m. Location, corner of Highway 74 and Riverside Avenue, 3.2 miles from her home. Witnesses, convenience store clerk visible through the window. Security cameras covering the parking lot from at least 2 angles. Traffic passing on the highway. Webb walked her to his patrol vehicle. Opened the back door. Put his hand on top of her head and guided her into the seat with the kind of casual force that suggested this was routine for him. The door slammed shut. Diane sat in the back of the police car and felt something crack inside her chest. Not her composure, she'd maintained that until the very end the way she always did. But something deeper, something that had believed, despite everything she knew about policing and power and the intersection of race and authority, that her position would protect her. That her credentials and her achievements and her federal appointment would create some kind of shield that made her immune to this. She had been wrong. Through the partition she watched Webb return to her mother's Honda. He pulled out his flashlight. Shone it through the windows. Walked around the vehicle examining it from every angle. Looking for probable cause he could articulate later. Looking for justification he could type into a report that would transform an unlawful stop into something defensible. He popped the trunk. Diane closed her eyes. Breathed slowly. Waited. The trunk contained exactly what you'd expect in a 73-year-old woman's car. A first aid kit. Jumper cables. A collapsible umbrella. A blanket her mother kept for emergencies. A box of tissues. Nothing remotely illegal or suspicious. Webb searched it anyway. Opened the first aid kit. Unfolded the blanket. Checked under the spare tire. Found absolutely nothing. He moved to the interior. Opened the glove compartment completely, pulling out the registration document Diane had already provided. along with an owner's manual and a collection of napkins from various fast food restaurants. Checked the center console. Found 63 cents in loose change, a pack of sugar-free gum, and a rosary that Ruth had kept there for 50 years. He searched the back seat. Looked under the floor mats. Opened every compartment. Found nothing. Because there was nothing to find. Diane watched him search with the kind of clinical detachment she used when reviewing evidence in court. She was already building the case in her mind. Unlawful stop based on a pretextual reason. Unlawful search conducted without consent or probable cause. Unlawful arrest for obstruction when the only thing she had obstructed was his violation of her constitutional rights. Webb returned to his vehicle empty-handed. He slid into the driver's seat, typed something into his computer and picked up his radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 347. I have a subject in custody. Need a female officer for transport to county jail. Subject is refusing to cooperate and claiming to be a federal judge. The dispatch response crackled through the radio. Copy that, 347. What's the charge? Obstruction of justice. Expired registration. Possible vehicle theft. Diane's eyes narrowed. Vehicle theft. He was escalating. Creating additional charges to justify the stop retroactively. He filed that away for later. Copy. Female officer ED 12 minutes. Webb turned around in his seat. Looked at Diane through the partition. His expression was satisfied, almost smug. Like he'd won something. You're going to have a long night, he said. Diane met his eyes. When she spoke, her voice was completely calm. No, Sergeant Webb. You are. Deputy Sarah Chin arrived 14 minutes later. Mid-30s. 8 years on the force. She pulled up in her patrol vehicle, got out, and approached Webb's car with professional efficiency. Webb gave her the briefing. Subject arrested for obstruction and expired registration. Claiming to be a federal judge. Refusing to cooperate. Needs transport to county jail for booking. Chin opened the back door. Looked at Diane with the kind of clinical assessment that comes from processing thousands of arrests. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle. Diane complied. Moved slowly and deliberately, hands still cuffed behind her back. Chin was smaller than Webb. Less aggressive in her body language. She guided Diane to her own patrol vehicle with a firmer but less hostile grip. Opened the back door. Helped her inside with something that almost resembled courtesy. Before closing the door, Chin paused. Looked at Diane more carefully. Something in the older woman's posture, in the absolute control of her expression, in the way she held herself despite being handcuffed and arrested at a gas station, made Chin hesitate. You said you're a federal judge? Chin asked. Yes, Diane said. Judge Diane Morrison. Central District of California. My chambers are in Los Angeles. If you call the federal courthouse and ask for the duty marshal, they can verify my identity in under a minute. Chin glanced back at Webb. He was leaning against his patrol car, arms crossed, clearly waiting for Chin to finish so he could clear the scene and move on with his night. Did he verify that? Chin asked. No, Diane said. He laughed and arrested me. Chen's expression shifted slightly. Not quite doubt, but something close to it. Do you have any identification that shows you're a judge? My federal credentials are in my chambers, Diane said. I was driving my mother's car because my own vehicle broke down. My mother died tonight. I was at the hospital. My phone is dead. Officer, I'm asking you to make one phone call. 60 seconds to verify. That's all I'm requesting. Chin chewed her lower lip. She looked at Diane. Looked at Webb. Looked at the beat-up Honda Civic with the expired tags. Made a decision. Okay, she said. I'll call. He walked over to Webb. Diane couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see Webb's body language change. He went from relaxed to defensive. Started gesturing with his hands. Shaking his head. Chin said something else. Webb's face flushed red. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. Then Chin pulled out her phone and made a call. Diane couldn't hear what was said, but she could see Chen's expression change. The skepticism melted away. Her eyes widened slightly. She glanced at Diane. Back at Webb. Back at Diane. Chin ended the call. Walked back to her patrol vehicle. Opened the back door where Diane sat. Judge Morrison, Chin said quietly. I just spoke with the duty marshal at the federal courthouse. He confirmed your identity. I'm going to uncuff you right now. I am so sorry about this. Diane didn't respond immediately. She waited while Chin unlocked the handcuffs, felt the metal fall away from her wrists, looked down at the red marks where they'd bitten into her skin. What happens now? Diane asked. Chin swallowed hard. I'm going to let you go. No charges. This was a mistake. A mistake, Diane repeated. Her tone was absolutely flat. Yes, ma'am. Was it a mistake when Sergeant Webb ignored my identification of myself as a federal judge? Was it a mistake when he refused to verify my credentials? Was it a mistake when he searched my vehicle without probable cause or consent? Was it a mistake when he arrested me for obstruction when the only thing I obstructed was his violation of my Fourth Amendment rights? Which part exactly was the mistake? Chin looked miserable. Judge Morrison, I want his badge number, Diane said. I want your badge number. I want the name of every officer who had contact with this stop. I want the dashcam footage from both vehicles. I want the convenience store security footage. And I want all of it preserved under federal evidence protocols because this is now a civil rights investigation. Chin nodded slowly. I'll make sure everything is preserved. Thank you, Deputy Chin. Diane stood. Her legs were shaky from adrenaline and exhaustion and grief that had been buried under legal analysis for the last 40 minutes. One more thing. Yes, ma'am. Where is Sergeant Webb? Chin glanced toward Webb's patrol car. He was still standing there, but his posture had changed. The smugness was gone. He looked pale. Like he was beginning to understand that something had gone very wrong. He's over there, Chin said. I'd like to speak with him, Diane said. Chin hesitated. Are you sure that's a good idea? I'm absolutely certain. Chin led Diane across the parking lot. Webb watched them approach. His hand dropped to his belt, fingers brushing his service weapon in a gesture Diane recognized as defensive anxiety rather than actual threat assessment. Diane stopped 6 feet away from him. Close enough to speak without raising her voice. Far enough to maintain appropriate distance. When she spoke, her tone was perfectly controlled. Sergeant Webb. My name is Judge Diane Ruth Morrison. I am a United States District Judge for the Central District of California. 6 months ago, I presided over United States versus Riverside County Sheriff's Department. I ruled in favor of the Department of Justice on 17 counts of systematic civil rights violations. I imposed a consent decree requiring your department to implement comprehensive reforms to prevent exactly this kind of racial profiling and unlawful detention. Webb's face had gone from pale to gray. Tonight, Diane continued, you stopped me without probable cause. You refused to verify my federal credentials. You searched my vehicle without consent. You arrested me for obstruction when I asserted my constitutional rights. You did all of this while I was driving home from the hospital where my mother died 6 hours ago. She paused. Let that sink in. Here's what's going to happen next. I'm going to file a formal complaint with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. I'm going to request a full investigation into this incident and into your pattern of stops over the last 5 years. Every stop you've made will be analyzed for racial disparities. Every search will be reviewed for constitutional compliance. Every arrest will be examined for probable cause. And if the data shows what I suspect it will show, that you have systematically targeted minority drivers, you will face federal charges for civil rights violations. Webb found his voice. It came out hoarse. You can't do that. I absolutely can, Diane said. And I will. Because what you did tonight wasn't a mistake, Sergeant. It was a choice. You chose not to believe me when I identified myself. You chose not to verify my credentials. You chose to search and arrest me based on nothing more than your assumptions about what a federal judge should look like. And that choice is going to cost you everything. He turned to Chin. Deputy Chin, please take me to my vehicle. I'd like to go home now. Chin nodded quickly, guided Diane back across the parking lot. Webb stood frozen watching them go. Diane got into her mother's Honda. The engine started on the first try, reliable even after 26 years. She sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly. Then she drove home. Diane made it to her house at 3:17 a.m., pulled into the garage, turned off the engine, sat in the darkness for a long time. Her mother was dead. She had been arrested. She had been handcuffed and searched and humiliated at a gas station while wearing sweatpants and her mother's college hoodie. And somewhere in the last hour, the grief she'd been suppressing had transformed into something else entirely. Rage. Controlled. Absolutely focused rage. She went inside. Plugged in her phone. While it charged, she opened her laptop and began typing. Notes on the incident. Every detail she could remember. Timestamps. Names. Badge numbers. Exact quotes of what Webb had said. The smell of the gas station. The texture of the handcuffs. The way Chen's expression had changed when she verified Diane's identity. She wrote for 47 minutes. When she finished, she had 6 single-spaced pages of documentation that would serve as the foundation for everything that followed. Then she made phone calls. First call. Chief Judge Patricia Santos of the Central District of California. Diane's direct supervisor and the administrative head of the entire district. The phone rang 4 times before a sleepy voice answered. "This better be important, Diane." "Patricia, I need to report an incident." Diane's voice was steady. Professional. "I was arrested tonight by Riverside County Sheriff's Department. I identified myself as a federal judge. The arresting officer refused to verify my credentials and proceeded with an unlawful search and arrest. I'm filing formal complaints with DOJ Civil Rights Division and requesting an immediate investigation." The sleepy fog cleared from Patricia's voice instantly. "Are you okay?" "Yes." "Tell me everything." Diane recounted the incident in precise detail. The stop. The search. The arrest. Webb's refusal to verify her identity. Chen's eventual confirmation. The handcuffs that had left marks on her wrists that were still visible as she spoke. Patricia listened without interruption. When Diane finished, there was a long silence. "This is going to be a shitstorm," Patricia said finally. "I know. The media is going to run with this for weeks." "I know. Are you absolutely certain you want to go forward? Because once we report this, there's no pulling back." "I'm certain," Diane said. "What happened tonight was unlawful, unconstitutional, and rooted in racial bias. If I don't challenge it, I'm complicit in allowing it to continue." "Okay," Patricia said. "I'll make the calls. Federal marshals will interview you first thing in the morning. DOJ will open an investigation. And Diane." "Yes. I'm sorry about your mother." The unexpected kindness cracked something in Diane's composure. Her throat tightened. "Thank you." She ended the call. Made the second one. Deputy U.S. Marshal Angela Reeves. Judicial Security for the Central District. The marshal who had verified Diane's identity when Chen had called. Reeves answered on the second ring, voice alert despite the early hour. "Judge Morrison. Are you safe?" "Yes," Diane said. "I'm home. I need to report a security incident and request a formal investigation." "I've already started the paperwork," Reeves said. "The moment Deputy Chen called to verify your identity, I knew something had gone wrong. Tell me what happened." Diane went through it again. Third time telling the story. It was getting easier, the emotional distance growing with each repetition. By the time she finished, her voice was completely steady. "We'll have a team at your house at 8 a.m., Reeves said. "We'll photograph the marks on your wrists. Get your statement on record. Secure all available footage. This is going to be treated as a federal incident with full investigative resources." "Thank you." "One more thing," Reeves said. "Is there any chance Sergeant Webb knew who you were before he stopped you?" Diane paused. Considered the question carefully. "I don't think so. He seemed genuinely surprised when I identified myself." "Why?" "Because if he knew you were the judge who issued the consent decree against his department and stopped you anyway, that's not just racial profiling. That's retaliation against a federal official. And that's a whole different level of federal crime." Diane felt something cold settle in her chest. "Run his record. Check if he's testified in any of my cases. See if there's any prior contact." "Already on it," Reeves said. "Try to get some rest, Judge. Tomorrow is going to be intense." Diane ended the call. Looked at the clock. 4:23 a.m. In 3 hours and 37 minutes, she was supposed to be in court to hear oral arguments on a motion to dismiss in a securities fraud case. She had spent 0 time preparing. Her mother was dead. She had been arrested and searched and humiliated. She could ask for a continuance. Any other judge would. Grief leave was standard procedure for the death of an immediate family member. But taking leave meant letting Webb win. Meant showing weakness. Meant allowing one unlawful stop to disrupt her ability to do her job. Diane Morrison didn't lose. And she sure as hell wasn't going to start now. She took a shower. The hot water stung the raw skin on her wrists where the handcuffs had bitten in. She washed her face. Put on makeup to cover the redness around her eyes. Selected a charcoal suit and pearl earrings. Armor that had never failed her. Pinned her federal judiciary lapel pin to her collar. By 7:30 a.m. she looked like a federal judge. Composed. Professional. Completely in control. The grief was still there. The exhaustion was still there. The rage was still there. But none of it showed on her face. At 7:58 a.m. federal marshals arrived at her house. They photographed her wrists from 6 different angles, documenting the bruising and abrasions. Took her formal statement. Secured copies of her notes. Confirmed that all available video footage had been preserved. At 9:47 a.m., Judge Diane Morrison took the bench in courtroom 7A of the Edward R. Roybal Federal Building. She heard oral arguments for 2 hours and 19 minutes. Issued a preliminary ruling from the bench denying the motion to dismiss. Set a trial date. Her voice never wavered. Her focus never slipped. No one in that courtroom would have guessed that she'd been arrested 11 hours earlier. At 12:15 p.m. her clerk knocked on her chamber's door. "Judge Morrison? There's someone here to see you from the Department of Justice." Diane looked up from the sentencing memorandum she was reviewing. "Send them in." The man who entered was mid-40s, African-American, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He extended a hand. "Judge Morrison. I'm Assistant Attorney General Marcus Thornton, Civil Rights Division. I'm here about last night." Diane gestured to the chair across from her desk. "What's the status of the investigation?" "Fast-tracked," Thornton said. "We've secured all video footage from the convenience store, both patrol vehicles and 3 traffic cameras in the area. We've interviewed Deputy Chin. We've pulled Sergeant Webb's complete service record and every stop he's made in the last 10 years. And we've assigned a team of 12 investigators to conduct a full pattern and practice review of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department." "Good," Diane said. "Judge, I need to ask you something directly." Thornton leaned forward slightly. "How do you want to handle this? We can pursue this quietly, file charges, negotiate a settlement, impose reforms without media attention. Or we can make this public and use your case as leverage to force comprehensive accountability. Your choice." Diane didn't hesitate. "Public. I want every detail documented. I want the investigation transparent. I want the results made available to the press. Because what happened to me happens to people every day who don't have the resources or the platform to fight back. If I stay quiet, I'm protecting a system that needs to be exposed." Thornton nodded slowly. "You understand what that means. Media coverage. Public scrutiny. People questioning your judgment, your credibility, your professionalism. They'll dig into every case you've ever decided. Every ruling you've made. They'll look for reasons to discredit you. Let them look," Diane said. "My record speaks for itself." "Oui," Thornton said. He stood. Extended his hand again. "Then let's burn it all down." If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it. And let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one. The story broke on a Friday afternoon. Los Angeles Times ran it above the fold. Federal judge arrested during traffic stop. DOJ investigating civil rights violations. By Saturday morning it was national news. Fox News. Every major outlet running the same basic narrative with their own editorial spin. Conservative media questioned whether Diane had been uncooperative. Liberal media called it racial profiling. Legal analysts debated whether the stop was constitutional. Everyone had an opinion. The video footage was released on Monday. The Department of Justice posted it on their website with full transparency. Dash cam from Webb's patrol car. Dash cam from Chen's patrol car. Security footage from the convenience store from 3 different angles. All synchronized. All time-stamped. All showing exactly what happened. The internet exploded. Within 48 hours, the video had been viewed 23 million times. Twitter was on fire. Reddit had 17 different threads analyzing every frame. TikTok users were creating reaction videos. The hashtag Judge Morrison was trending nationwide. What made it devastating wasn't the violence. There was no violence. What made it devastating was the contempt. The footage showed everything. Diane's Civic pulling into the gas station parking lot. Webb approaching with his hand on his weapon like she was a threat. The window rolling down 4 inches. The conversation that couldn't be heard on the convenience store footage but was crystal clear on the dash cam audio. Why was I stopped, officer? Expired registration. License and registration. Now. The registration belongs to my mother. She passed away tonight. Sorry for your loss. I still need to see your license and registration. The exchange was clinical. Professional. Nothing overtly aggressive. Until Diane identified herself as a federal judge. Then came the moment that would be replayed 10,000 times. Webb's laugh. Not subtle. Not restrained. A full, dismissive, contemptuous laugh that said exactly what he thought about the possibility that this woman could be a federal judge. A federal judge. Right. And I'm the Attorney General. The internet tore him apart. Legal experts pointed out that federal judges were required to carry credentials that could be verified in seconds. That any reasonable officer would have made that call before proceeding. That the failure to verify wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. Civil rights attorneys noted the pattern. Middle-aged black woman. Expensive purse. Beat-up car. Red eyes. The assumptions Webb had made were visible in his body language, audible in his tone. And then the data started coming out. The Department of Justice released preliminary findings from their investigation on Thursday. Sergeant Marcus Webb had made 2,847 traffic stops over the last 10 years. 73% had involved minority drivers in a county that was 68% white according to census data. The statistical analysis was damning. The disparity was too large to be explained by chance, location, or enforcement patterns. It showed intentional targeting. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came when investigators cross-referenced Webb's stops against case records in the Central District of California. Webb had testified in federal court 11 times over the last 4 years. 3 times as a witness in drug trafficking cases. Twice in weapons cases. 6 times in civil rights lawsuits against the Riverside County Sheriff's Department. And in 4 of those 11 appearances, he had been cross-examined by Diane Morrison. Not Judge Morrison. Prosecutor Morrison. Because before Diane had been appointed to the bench, she had spent 8 years as a federal prosecutor specializing in police misconduct cases. She had built her career taking apart officers who violated civil rights. She had destroyed witnesses on cross-examination with surgical precision. She had secured convictions that had sent corrupt cops to federal prison. And Marcus Webb had been one of her targets. She had cross-examined him in 2018. A case involving unlawful search and seizure. Webb had claimed he'd smelled marijuana, justifying a warrantless vehicle search. Diane had destroyed his testimony by introducing body cam footage showing he'd claimed to smell marijuana in 12 different stops over 6 months, an implausibly high number that suggested fabrication rather than legitimate probable cause. The case had been dismissed. The evidence had been suppressed. And Webb had been formally reprimanded by his department. So when investigators asked whether Webb had known who he was stopping, the answer was now clear. He might not have recognized her face at 2 a.m. in a gas station parking lot. But the moment she said her name, Judge Diane Ruth Morrison, he knew exactly who she was. The prosecutor who had humiliated him in federal court. The judge who had imposed the consent decree on his department. The person who represented everything he hated about oversight and accountability and federal interference in local law enforcement. And he had arrested her anyway. The charges were filed on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after the gas station stop. United States versus Marcus Webb. 7 federal counts. Count 1. Deprivation of rights under color of law, 18 U.S.C. Section 242. Maximum sentence. Life in prison if death results, otherwise 10 years. Count 2. Retaliation against a federal official, 18 U.S.C. Section 115. Maximum sentence, 6 years. Count 3. Obstruction of justice, 18 U.S.C. Section 1503. Maximum sentence, 10 years. Count 4. False arrest, 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. Civil damages to be determined. Counts 5 through 7. Conspiracy to violate civil rights, multiple violations. The indictment was 39 pages long. It detailed the stop, the search, the arrest, Webb's prior history of racially disparate stops, his previous testimony in Diane's courtroom, the statistical evidence of systematic profiling. But it also included something else. Something Webb's lawyers wouldn't discover until discovery was complete. Text messages. Investigators had secured a warrant for Webb's phone records 3 days after the stop. They found 2 years of text conversations with 4 other deputies in his unit. The content made the racial profiling case open and shut. Selected excerpts entered into the federal record. Webb, March 15, 2023, 11:47 p.m. Another uppity bitch in a Lexus. Gonna teach her some manners. Deputy Collins, March 15, 2023, 11:49 p.m. Did you run her plates first? Webb, March 15, 2023, 11:51 p.m. Don't need to. She's in the wrong neighborhood driving the wrong car. And 3 months before the gas station stop. Webb, August 4, 2024, 2:33 p.m. Consent decree is bullshit. Morrison thinks she can tell us how to do our jobs. Someone needs to remind her she's not untouchable. Deputy Martinez, August 4, 2024, 2:35 p.m. She's a federal judge. Pretty sure she is untouchable. Webb, August 4, 2024, 2:37 p.m. Nobody's untouchable. You just gotta catch them at the right time. The prosecution would argue that text was proof of premeditation. That Webb hadn't randomly stumbled across Judge Morrison at 2 a.m. That he had been waiting for an opportunity. That when he saw an expired registration on a beat-up Honda, he had taken his shot. The defense would argue coincidence. That the text was venting frustration, not planning a crime. That Webb had no way of knowing whose car he was stopping. But the jury would have to reconcile that with one undeniable fact. The moment Diane Morrison identified herself, Webb had a choice. Verify her credentials or proceed with the arrest. He had chosen to proceed. The arraignment was scheduled for November 28. 2 days before, Diane received a phone call from an unlisted number. She almost didn't answer. But something made her pick up. Judge Morrison. The voice was male. Unfamiliar. Nervous. Yes. This is Deputy Lewis Garrett. I need to talk to you. Diane frowned. The name was familiar. She pulled it up in her mental database of the thousands of people she'd encountered in her legal career. Deputy Lewis Garrett. Riverside County. Had testified in, she couldn't remember. What can I do for you, Deputy Garrett? I was there the night you were arrested, Garrett said quickly. I was Webb's backup. I should have. I'm calling because I need you to know I'm testifying for the prosecution. Diane sat up straighter. You're cooperating with the DOJ? Yes, ma'am. I'm giving them everything. Text messages. Audio recordings. Details about stops Webb made that never got reported. All of it. Why? There was a long pause. Because what he did to you was wrong. And it wasn't the first time. I've watched him profile people for years. I've watched him lie in reports. I've watched him cover his ass while destroying innocent people's lives. And I was too much of a coward to say anything because he's my sergeant and speaking up would have ended my career. And now? Diane asked. Now my career's probably over anyway. So I might as well do the right thing. Diane processed this. What are you giving them? Everything, Garrett said again. Webb kept records. He had a notebook where he tracked his stops by race. Called it his diversity portfolio. Made jokes about keeping his numbers up. He shared it with 3 other deputies like it was something to be proud of. Diane felt something cold spread through her chest. He documented his own racial profiling? In detail. Dates, times, demographics, comments about each stop. The DOJ has it now. They got it from his locker when they executed the search warrant. Jesus Christ, Diane said quietly. There's more, Garrett said. The night he stopped you, I heard the whole thing. I was en route before you were even out of the car. I heard him call in a suspicious vehicle stop and request female officer for transport. I knew something was wrong because he sounded too excited, like he'd caught a big fish. What did you do? Nothing, Garrett said. His voice cracked. I did nothing. I sat in my car and listened to him arrest a federal judge, and I didn't say a word because I was afraid of getting written up for questioning a superior officer. But you're speaking up now. It's not enough, Garrett said. It doesn't fix what happened, but maybe it prevents the next time. Maybe it does, Diane said. Thank you for calling, Deputy Garrett. I'm sorry, Garrett said. For what that's worth. Diane ended the call. Sat in the quiet of her chambers. Thought about courage and complicity and the fine line between the two. The trial began on January 14th. Federal courtroom in Los Angeles. Judge Michael Rourke presiding, brought in from the Northern District to ensure impartiality. The prosecution was led by Assistant Attorney General Marcus Thornton. The defense was led by Benjamin Cross, one of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in California. Jury selection took 3 days. The final jury, 7 women, 5 men. 3 black, 2 Hispanic, 1 Asian, 6 white. Ages ranging from 26 to 67. Occupations from teacher to software engineer to retired postal worker. Thornton's opening statement was clinical and devastating. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a choice. On November 9th at 2:17 a.m. Sergeant Marcus Webb made a choice. He saw a 1997 Honda Civic with expired tags. He ran the plate. He saw the registered owner was a 73-year-old woman. He saw the driver was a 51-year-old black woman. And he made a choice to stop that car. Thornton walked the jury through each decision point. The stop. The refusal to fully roll down the window. The request for identification. The presentation of credentials. The moment Diane said 5 words, "I'm a federal district judge." At that moment, Thornton said, Sergeant Webb had a choice. He could verify her identity with a single phone call that would take 60 seconds. Or he could proceed based on his assumption that this woman, a black woman in sweatpants and a college hoodie driving a beat-up car, could not possibly be who she said she was. He chose wrong. But it wasn't a mistake. It was a choice rooted in bias. And the evidence will show that this choice was part of a pattern spanning 10 years and nearly 3,000 traffic stops, 73% of which involved minority drivers in a county that is 68% white. This case is about accountability. About what happens when an officer abuses the power we grant them to enforce the law. And about what must happen when that abuse targets not just a citizen, but a federal judge who had spent her career fighting exactly this kind of constitutional violation. Cross's opening statement took a different approach. My client made a mistake, he said simply. He admits it. He regrets it. But a mistake is not a crime. Sergeant Webb did not stop Judge Morrison because she was black. He stopped her because her vehicle had expired registration. That is a legal traffic stop. What happened after, the failure to verify credentials, the decision to arrest, those were errors in judgment. But errors in judgment made in good faith are not federal crimes. The argument was legally defensible. But watching Cross make it, Diane could see the jury wasn't buying it. Because they'd already seen the video. The prosecution's case took 2 weeks. Video evidence came first. All 5 camera angles from the gas station stop, synchronized and played side by side. The jury watched Diane's Civic pull in. Watched Webb approach with his hand on his weapon. Watched the entire interaction from multiple perspectives. The audio was crystal clear. Diane's voice, hoarse with exhaustion and grief. My name is Diane Ruth Morrison. I am a United States District Judge. Webb's laugh. That damning, contemptuous laugh. 3 jurors visibly reacted. One woman, a middle school teacher, black, mid-40s, closed her eyes like she'd been slapped. Expert witnesses followed. Dr. Sarah Chin, a statistician from Stanford who specialized in analyzing racial bias in policing. She presented a comprehensive analysis of Webb's traffic stops over 10 years. 2,847 total stops. 2,078 involving minority drivers. In a county where minorities represented 32% of the population but somehow accounted for 73% of Webb's stops. The probability of this disparity occurring by chance, Dr. Chin testified, is less than 1 in 10 million. This pattern demonstrates intentional targeting based on race. Cross tried to poke holes in her methodology, suggested that minority drivers might commit more traffic violations, that Webb's patrol route might cover higher minority neighborhoods. That correlation didn't prove causation. Dr. Chin systematically dismantled each argument, showed that other officers patrolling the same routes had stop rates that matched demographic patterns, demonstrated that Webb's disparity persisted across different shifts, different routes, different time periods, proved that the only variable that explained the pattern was the officer himself. The notebook was introduced as Exhibit 47, a small spiral-bound notepad with a black cover, seized from Webb's locker during the search warrant execution. 127 pages of handwritten entries. Each entry followed the same format: date and time, vehicle description, driver demographics, race, age, gender, reason for stop, personal comments. The personal comments were what destroyed Webb's defense. November 3, 1:45 a.m. Black male, 30s, Escalade, uppity about being stopped, got real cooperative after some persuasion. February 17, 11:15 p.m. Hispanic female, 20s, Honda Accord started crying, let me search without warrant. June 8, 2:30 a.m. Black female, 40s, Mercedes, gave me attitude, arrested for obstruction. Page after page. Year after year. A documented record of racial profiling written in Webb's own hand. Cross objected strenuously. Argued the notebook was taken out of context. That these were personal notes never meant to be policy. That they didn't prove discriminatory intent. Judge Rourke overruled the objection. The notebook stayed in evidence. Text messages were introduced next. 2 years of conversations between Webb and 4 other deputies. The prosecution focused on 3 specific exchanges. First, from August 2024, 3 months before the Morrison stop. Webb, consent decree is bullshit. Morrison thinks she can tell us how to do our jobs. This established that Webb knew who Judge Morrison was and held animosity toward her. Second, from November 2024, 2 weeks before the stop. Webb, working graveyard shift next week. Highway 74. Good hunting ground. Deputy Collins, watch yourself. You're already on the consent decree watch list. Webb, let them watch. I know my rights. This established that Webb knew he was under scrutiny and proceeded anyway. Third, from November 9, 2024, at 2:43 a.m., 13 minutes after arresting Diane. Webb, just bagged a big one. You'll never guess who. Deputy Martinez. Who? Webb, Judge fucking Morrison. Driving her dead mommy's car with expired tags. Arrested her for obstruction. She's gonna lose her shit when she realizes I'm not letting this slide. Deputy Martinez. Dude. You arrested the judge who wrote the consent decree? Webb. Yep. And it felt good. The courtroom went silent when that exchange was read aloud. Cross scrambled. Argued the text showed frustration, not criminal intent. That venting to colleagues wasn't evidence of malice. But the jury had already decided. You could see it in their faces. Diane took the stand on the trial's 9th day. She wore a navy suit. Pearl earrings. Federal Judiciary pin on her collar. She walked to the witness stand with the same composed authority she brought to the bench. Thornton led her through the direct examination methodically. Her background. Her education. Her career as a prosecutor. Her appointment to the federal bench. The consent decree case against Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Her familiarity with Marcus Webb from his previous testimony in her courtroom. Then they moved to November 9th. Judge Morrison, can you tell the jury what you were doing immediately before the traffic stop? Diane's voice was steady. I was at Mercy General Hospital. My mother, Ruth Morrison, was dying from pancreatic cancer. I had received a call from her oncologist at 7:43 p.m. telling me I should come immediately. I drove to the hospital. I was with her when she passed away at 1:58 a.m. What was your emotional state when you left the hospital? I was grieving. Exhausted. My phone had died. I just wanted to go home. Whose car were you driving? My mother's 1997 Honda Civic. My own vehicle had broken down earlier that day. I took her car to the hospital. Were you aware the registration was expired? No. I grabbed the keys and left. I wasn't thinking about registration or anything else except getting to my mother before she died. Tell the jury what happened when Sergeant Webb pulled you over. Diane recounted the stop in precise detail. Webb's aggressive approach. The refusal to explain why she'd been stopped. Her identification of herself as a federal judge. His laughter. The search. The arrest. The handcuffs tightened deliberately enough to leave marks. What went through your mind when Sergeant Webb laughed? I realized, Diane said quietly, that my credentials, my position, my authority, none of it mattered. Because in that moment, all Sergeant Webb saw was a black woman in an old car. And he had already decided I was lying. Did you resist arrest? No. I complied with every lawful order. I also clearly and repeatedly stated that the stop was unlawful and that I did not consent to any search. Why did you comply if you believed the stop was unlawful? Because I'm a federal judge, Diane said. I know what happens to people who resist unlawful arrest. Especially black people. Resistance can be fatal. So I complied. And I documented everything so I could seek justice through legal channels rather than through physical confrontation that could get me killed. Cross's cross-examination tried to establish that Diane had been uncooperative. Judge Morrison, you refused to roll your window all the way down, correct? I rolled it down sufficiently to communicate and present my identification. But not all the way. There is no legal requirement to roll a window all the way down during a traffic stop. You questioned why you were being stopped? Yes. I had a legal right to know the reason for the stop. You identified yourself as a federal judge even though you had no credentials with you to prove it? I identified myself truthfully. I explained that my credentials were in my office and offered to wait while Sergeant Webb verified my identity through the federal courthouse. But you didn't have proof? My identity could have been verified in 60 seconds with a single phone call. Sergeant Webb chose not to make that call. Cross shifted tactics. Judge Morrison, isn't it true that you had previously cross-examined Sergeant Webb in federal court? Yes. In 2018. And that cross-examination resulted in evidence being suppressed and charges being dismissed? Yes. And Sergeant Webb being formally reprimanded? Yes. So you had personal animosity towards Sergeant Webb before this traffic stop even occurred? Diane's expression didn't change. I had professional familiarity with Sergeant Webb based on his testimony in a case I prosecuted. I had no personal relationship with him whatsoever. But you remembered him? I remember every witness I've cross-examined. That's my job. And now you're testifying against him in federal criminal court? I'm testifying truthfully about what happened to me on November 9th. Whether Sergeant Webb is the defendant or not doesn't change the facts. Cross tried for another hour. Couldn't shake her. Couldn't find inconsistencies. Couldn't trap her in contradictions. Finally he sat down. Thornton stood for redirect. Judge Morrison, one final question. Do you believe Sergeant Webb would have arrested you if you were white? Cross shot to his feet. Objection. Calls for speculation. Judge Rourke considered. I'll allow it. The witness may answer based on her professional experience. Diane looked directly at the jury. No. I don't believe a white woman in identical circumstances. Same clothes, same car, same expired registration, same identification as a federal judge, would have been arrested. I believe she would have been believed. Her credentials would have been verified. She would have been sent home with a warning about updating the registration. Because the assumption that someone couldn't possibly be who they said they were is rooted in racial bias about who belongs in positions of authority. Thank you, Judge Morrison. Thornton sat down. Diane was excused. She walked out of the courtroom with the same composed dignity she'd brought in. But in her chambers afterward, alone, she finally let herself cry. If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it. And let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one. The defense case lasted 3 days. Cross called character witnesses. Fellow officers who testified Webb was professional, dedicated, not racist. His ex-wife who said he'd never shown racial bias in their marriage. His pastor who described him as a man of faith and integrity. The prosecution destroyed each witness on cross-examination. The fellow officers admitted under questioning that they'd never actually reviewed Webb's stop data. Never looked at the demographic breakdown. Never questioned why his numbers were so different from everyone else's. The ex-wife admitted they'd divorced in 2019, 5 years ago, and hadn't spoken since. The pastor admitted Webb attended church maybe twice a year and had never discussed racial issues in their limited conversations. Webb himself took the stand on the final day of the defense case. He was 47 years old. 22 years on the force. No prior disciplinary record except the 2018 reprimand from Diane's cross-examination. He had 3 kids. Paid child support. Coached Little League on his days off. Cross led him through a carefully constructed narrative. The stop was based solely on expired registration. He hadn't recognized Judge Morrison. The laughter was nervous reaction to an absurd claim, not contempt. The arrest was based on her failure to comply with his lawful orders. "I made mistakes," Webb said. His voice was practiced, remorseful, calibrated for jury sympathy. "I should have verified her credentials. I should have been more patient. But I didn't stop her because she was black. I stopped her because her registration was expired. That's all it was." Thornton stood for cross-examination. Approached the witness stand slowly. "Sergeant Webb, you testified that you didn't recognize Judge Morrison when you stopped her?" "That's correct." "But you knew who Judge Morrison was?" "I knew the name. From the consent decree case." "You testified in her courtroom?" "Yes." "In 2018. And she had cross-examined you?" "Yes." "Aggressively." "She was thorough." "That cross-examination led to evidence being suppressed?" "Yes." "And you being reprimanded?" "Yes." "So you had reason to hold animosity toward Judge Morrison?" Webb shifted in his seat. "I didn't appreciate being embarrassed in court. But I didn't hold a grudge." "No." Thornton pulled out a document. "This is a text message you sent on August 4, 2024. 3 months before you stopped Judge Morrison. Can you read it for the jury?" Webb's jaw tightened. He read in a flat voice. "Consent decree is bullshit. Morrison thinks she can tell us how to do our jobs. Someone needs to remind her she's not untouchable." "Someone needs to remind her she's not untouchable," Thornton repeated. "What did you mean by that?" "I was frustrated. Venting." "About Judge Morrison specifically?" "About the consent decree. About federal oversight. About Judge Morrison. She wrote the decree. So yes, about her. And 3 months later, you stopped her car at 2 a.m.? It was a coincidence. Was it?" Thornton pulled out another document. "This is the dispatch log from November 9th. It shows you called in the stop at 2:17 a.m. But your GPS tracker shows you'd been parked behind that gas station for 17 minutes before the stop." "Why?" Webb hesitated. "I was on break." "On break? For 17 minutes? At 2 a.m.? In a gas station parking lot on Highway 74 that happens to be on the route between the federal courthouse and Judge Morrison's home. I didn't know it was her route. You testified in her courtroom 4 times. You never noticed where she lived." "Objection," Cross said. "Speculation. Withdrawn." Thornton moved closer. "Sergeant Webb, when Judge Morrison told you she was a federal judge, why didn't you verify her identity?" I didn't think it was necessary." "You didn't think it was necessary to spend 60 seconds making a phone call that would confirm whether the person you were about to arrest was telling the truth?" "She didn't have credentials. She told you they were in her office. She offered to wait while you verified. You chose not to. Why?" "I didn't believe her." "Why not?" "Because." Webb trailed off. "Because she was a black woman in sweatpants driving a beat-up car and federal judges don't look like that? Is that what you thought?" "No." "Then why didn't you believe her?" Webb had no answer. Thornton let the silence stretch. Then he pulled out the notebook. Exhibit 47. Flipped to a page marked with a sticky note. "This is your notebook, correct? The one seized from your locker?" "Yes." "You kept detailed records of your traffic stops?" "Personal notes." "Including the race of the drivers you stopped?" "Sometimes." In 127 pages, You documented race in 119 entries. That's 94% of your stops. Why? I don't know. You don't know why you tracked race in nearly every stop you made? Webb said nothing. Let me read one entry. November 3, 2022. Black male 30s escalate. Uppity about being stopped. Got real cooperative after some persuasion. What did you mean by persuasion? I don't remember that stop specifically. How about this one? Hispanic female 20s Honda Accord. Started crying, let me search without warrant. You searched her vehicle without a warrant. She consented. Did you document that consent in your official report? Webb's face flushed. I don't recall. You don't recall. How convenient. Thornton flipped through pages. Here's another interesting entry. June 8, 2023. Black female 40s Mercedes. Gave me attitude, arrested for obstruction. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? I've made a lot of stops. Yes, you have. 2,847 over 10 years. 73% involving minority drivers. In a county that's 68% white. Can you explain that disparity? Minorities commit more traffic violations. Do they? Because Dr. Chin testified that other officers in your same unit, patrolling the same routes, had stop rates matching demographic patterns. You're the outlier. Why? Webb had no answer. Thornton went for the kill. Sergeant Webb at 2:43 a.m. on November 9th, 13 minutes after you arrested Judge Morrison, you sent a text to Deputy Martinez. Can you read it for the jury? Webb's face went pale. He read mechanically. Just bagged a big one. You'll never guess who. And the next message? Judge fucking Morrison. Driving her dead mommy's car with expired tags. Arrested her for obstruction. She's gonna lose her shit when she realizes I'm not letting this slide. She's gonna lose her shit when she realizes I'm not letting this slide, Thornton repeated. What did you mean by that? I was angry. At Judge Morrison? At the situation. At Judge Morrison for having the audacity to identify herself as a federal judge while black? No. Then what? What weren't you letting slide? Webb's composure cracked. She humiliated me in court. She made me look incompetent. He got me reprimanded. And then the consent decree, her decree, made my job impossible. So yeah, when I saw an opportunity to... He stopped. Realized what he'd just said. The courtroom was dead silent. When you saw an opportunity to what, Sergeant Webb? Webb stared at Thornton. Then at the jury. Then at his hands. No further questions, Thornton said. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 27 minutes. They returned guilty verdicts on all 7 counts. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Webb remained free on bail, electronic monitoring, pending the hearing. During those 6 weeks, more information emerged. The Department of Justice expanded its investigation. Found 4 other deputies who had been coordinating with Webb. Seized their phones, their notebooks, their patrol records. What they discovered was worse than anyone had suspected. It wasn't just racial profiling. It was a systematic operation. Webb and his team had been targeting minority drivers in expensive cars specifically. They'd pull them over on pretextual stops, expired tags, broken taillights, suspicious driving. They'd search without warrants or with manufactured probable cause. And when they found anything, drugs, weapons, outstanding warrants, they'd use it as leverage. Some drivers paid cash to make the charges go away. Others provided information on other targets. The operation had generated over $240,000 in unreported income over 8 years, split 5 ways among the participating deputies. It was a shakedown ring operating under color of law. Diane learned about this on a Tuesday morning when Marcus Thornton called her chambers. "We've got something," he said. "Something big. Can you come to the Federal building?" She arrived an hour later. Was led to a secure conference room where Thornton and 6 other DOJ attorneys had assembled. They walked her through it. The operation. The money. The pattern. The victims. 127 identified so far, with more coming forward every day. "This is bigger than one bad cop," Thornton said. "This is systematic corruption. And it's been happening under a consent decree that was supposed to prevent exactly this. What do you need from me?" Diane asked. We need you to authorize expanded charges. Racketeering, conspiracy, money laundering. We're going to dismantle the entire operation and prosecute everyone involved. Diane didn't hesitate. Authorized. Do it. Sentencing day arrived on March 15th. Judge Rourke had reviewed everything. The trial transcripts. The expanded investigation findings. The victim impact statements. All of it. The courtroom was packed. Media in the back rows. Victims in the gallery. Webb's family on one side. Diane sitting alone on the other. Rourke took the bench. Called the case. Asked if anyone wanted to speak before sentence was pronounced. 14 victims gave statements. A black man who had been stopped 17 times in 3 years. Lost his job because of a bogus arrest. Lost his apartment. Ended up homeless. A Hispanic woman who had paid Webb $2,000 to make drug charges disappear. Charges that were based on a search conducted without probable cause. An elderly black couple who had been pulled over on their way to their granddaughter's funeral. Were forced to the ground at gunpoint. Humiliated in front of passing traffic. Never received an apology. Each statement added weight to what was coming. Finally, Diane stood. Your Honor, I don't speak today as a victim. I speak as a federal judge who has spent 23 years in the legal profession. Who has seen the best and worst of our justice system. Who has presided over cases that required me to balance punishment with redemption, accountability with mercy. She paused. Looked directly at Webb. What Sergeant Webb did to me was unlawful, unconstitutional, and rooted in racial bias. But what he did to these other victims, these people who didn't have my resources, my platform, my ability to fight back, that was even worse. He weaponized his authority. He preyed on vulnerable people. He built a criminal enterprise that operated for 8 years while supervision looked the other way. This isn't about one bad stop. This is about systematic abuse. And the sentence must reflect that. She sat down. Webb's attorney asked for leniency. Mentioned his kids. His coaching. His otherwise clean record. Rourke listened without expression. Then he delivered the sentence. Sergeant Marcus Webb, you have been convicted of 7 federal counts involving civil rights violations, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. The sentencing guidelines recommend a range of 87 to 108 months. I am imposing an upward departure based on aggravating factors. He went through them methodically. The racial targeting. The financial crimes. The abuse of authority. The targeting of a federal judge. The systematic nature of the operation. The sentence is 204 months in federal prison. 17 years. No possibility of parole under federal sentencing guidelines. Webb's face crumpled. His attorney looked stunned. But Rourke wasn't finished. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution to identified victims in the amount of $240,000. You will forfeit all pension benefits. Your law enforcement certification is permanently revoked. And you are prohibited from seeking employment in any law enforcement or security capacity for life. The gavel came down. 17 years. Webb would be 64 when he got out. His career was over. His reputation destroyed. His freedom measured in decades. The 4 other deputies received sentences ranging from 6 to 12 years each. The supervising lieutenant who had ignored complaints received 8 years for conspiracy and deliberate indifference. The entire criminal enterprise was dismantled in a single afternoon. But Diane wasn't finished. 3 weeks after sentencing, she filed a civil lawsuit. Morrison versus Riverside County Sheriff's Department. Federal civil rights action seeking damages and institutional reform. The county offered to settle for $1.2 million within 6 weeks. Standard amount for a federal judge case. Enough to make it go away quietly. Diane rejected the offer. She demanded public trial. Full transparency. Institutional accountability that a confidential settlement would obscure. The case went to trial in June. The civil trial lasted 3 weeks. Evidence showed the department had received 89 complaints against Webb and his team over 8 years. Every single complaint had been dismissed internally without proper investigation. Early warning systems had flagged Webb's stop patterns as statistical outliers 7 different times. Supervision had acknowledged the flags and done nothing. The department had created a culture that rewarded aggressive enforcement without meaningful accountability. had failed to implement the consent decree requirements that Judge Morrison herself had imposed 4 years earlier. The verdict came back with numbers that made national headlines. $47 million in total damages. $12 million compensatory, for pain and suffering, emotional distress, violation of civil rights. $35 million punitive, specifically designed to punish the department for systematic indifference to constitutional violations that had been documented, ignored, and allowed to continue for 8 years. It was the second largest civil rights verdict in California history. The county appealed. Lost on every ground. The verdict stood in full. Diane held a press conference on the courthouse steps the day the appeal was denied. She stood at a podium with the federal courthouse behind her. Wore her judicial robes. Spoke directly to the cameras. I didn't pursue this case for money. I pursued it for accountability. For justice. For the 127 victims who suffered under Sergeant Webb's operation. For the thousands of people who are profiled every day by officers who believe their authority puts them above the law. She paused. Let that settle. Every dollar of this settlement will be donated to organizations working to prevent what happened to me from happening to others. The donations were announced with specific amounts. $15 million to the National Police Accountability Project. $12 million to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. $10 million to the Innocence Project. $10 million to community legal aid organizations across California. Not a single dollar kept for personal use. The entire $47 million channeled into systematic reform. The Morrison Justice Foundation was established using her name and funded by the settlement. Mission: 3 areas. 1. Funding legal representation for victims of police misconduct who couldn't afford attorneys. 2. Developing training programs for law enforcement on constitutional policing and implicit bias. 3. Supporting legislative reforms requiring independent oversight, mandatory body cameras, and public reporting of stop data. The Foundation's results over the first 2 years exceeded all projections. 87 wrongfully convicted individuals freed. Legal representation provided to over 600 defendants facing charges based on questionable stops. Model legislation adopted by 14 states. Training programs delivered to over 300 law enforcement agencies. $8 million in additional grants distributed to grassroots organizations. The transformation was comprehensive. What had begun as a single unlawful stop at a gas station had exposed an 8-year criminal enterprise and created institutional reforms affecting millions of people across multiple states. 3 years after the sentencing, Diane received a letter. It came from a federal prison in Texas. The return address showed the sender, Marcus Webb. Inmate #08847-112. He almost threw it away. Almost refused to give him even that much of her attention. But something made her open it. The letter was 4 pages. Handwritten. The penmanship shaky. Judge Morrison, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to respond to this letter. I'm writing because my therapist says I need to take accountability for what I did. Not the legal accountability. I'm serving 17 years for that. The moral accountability. What I did to you was wrong. Not just illegal. Wrong. I profiled you. I refused to believe you when you told me the truth. I arrested you because of the color of your skin and the car you were driving, and because I couldn't accept that a black woman could be a federal judge. But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is what I did to everyone else. The people who didn't have your credentials or your platform or your ability to fight back. I destroyed lives. I stole money. I used the badge to prey on vulnerable people. I told myself I was just doing my job. That I was keeping communities safe. That the people I stopped deserved it. Those were lies I told myself to justify behavior I knew was wrong. I've spent 3 years in here thinking about what made me that person. Was it the academy training? The department culture? The way supervision rewarded aggressive numbers without asking questions? Was it something deeper? Racism I learned growing up and never challenged? I don't have good answers. But I know this: I became the thing I swore I'd never be. A corrupt cop. The kind of officer who gives everyone else a bad name. You said in court that the sentence had to reflect systematic abuse. You were right. I didn't just make individual mistakes. I built a system designed to exploit people. I can't undo the harm. I can't give back the years I took from people with bogus arrest. I can't repair the trust one destroyed. But I want you to know that what you did mattered. The lawsuit, the reforms, the foundation. I've been following the news. Reading about people being freed. About legislation passing. About departments changing their policies. You turned the worst thing I ever did into something that's actually making a difference. I know this doesn't fix anything. I know 17 years isn't enough. But for what it's worth, I'm sorry. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to understand how I became someone who would laugh when a grieving woman told me she was a federal judge. I hope you never have to think about me again. Marcus Webb. Diane read the letter 3 times. Sat with it for a long time. Tried to decide how she felt. She didn't forgive him. Forgiveness wasn't hers to give. It belonged to the 127 victims whose lives he damaged. But she recognized something genuine in the words. Something that suggested accountability might actually be taking root. She never responded to the letter. But she kept it. Filed it away with all the other documentation from the case. Because it mattered. Not as absolution, but as evidence that even the worst failures could lead to growth if people were willing to face what they'd done. 5 years after the gas station stop, Diane stood in front of the California State Assembly. She had been invited to speak about police reform legislation. The Morrison Act, named after her case, was being debated. It would require independent oversight boards with subpoena power in all counties over 500,000 population. Mandatory body cameras with footage stored by third parties. Public databases tracking stops by race, age, gender, and outcome. Early intervention systems with automatic investigation triggers. Civilian review of use of force incidents. The legislation faced opposition from law enforcement unions. They argued it was anti-police, that it would handcuff officers, that it would make communities less safe. Diane listened to the arguments. Then she spoke. I was a federal prosecutor for 8 years. I worked with police officers every day. I saw the best of law enforcement. Officers who put their lives on the line to protect communities. Who showed courage and integrity and genuine commitment to justice. I also saw the worst. Officers who abused their authority. Who violated constitutional rights. Who preyed on vulnerable people. This legislation isn't anti-police. It's pro-accountability. It's pro-community. It's pro-justice. Because here's what I learned from my experience. The officers doing the right thing have nothing to fear from oversight. Body cameras protect good cops as much as they expose bad ones. Public data helps departments identify problems before they become crises. Independent review builds community trust. The only people who benefit from opacity are those with something to hide. She looked directly at the assembled legislators. On November 9, 2024, I was arrested at a gas station while driving home from my mother's deathbed. I was profiled, searched without probable cause, handcuffed and humiliated, and the only reason I could fight back was because I had resources most people don't have. But what about everyone else? What about the people who don't have federal credentials or legal training or institutional support? They deserve the same protection, the same accountability, the same justice. This legislation won't solve all problems, but it will create the transparency needed to identify them, the accountability needed to address them, and the oversight needed to prevent them. I urge you to pass this bill. Not for me, for the next person who gets stopped at 2 a.m., who gets profiled, who gets told their truth doesn't matter. Give them the tools to fight back. Give communities the data to demand change. Give good officers the support they need to do their jobs right. That's what justice looks like. The Morrison Act passed 67-13. It was signed into law 3 weeks later. Within 2 years, 14 other states had adopted similar legislation. The reforms became a national model. 7 years after the gas station stop, Diane received an award from the National Bar Association, the Thurgood Marshall Award for Civil Rights Achievement. She stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., accepted a crystal plaque, gave a speech to 2,000 attorneys from across the country. But the moment that mattered came afterward. A young black woman approached her. Mid-20s. Law student based on the backpack and the exhausted look every law student carries. Judge Morrison, I just wanted to thank you. For what? Diane asked. For fighting back. For not taking the settlement and staying quiet. For showing that even federal judges aren't immune to racial profiling. For turning what happened to you into something that's actually changing the system." The woman paused. Swallowed hard. "I was pulled over last year. Bogus stop. Cop said I fit the description of a suspect. Wanted to search my car. I said no. He threatened to arrest me. I told him about the Morrison Act requirements. About body cameras. About public oversight. He backed down. Let me go with a warning. Your case literally saved me from what you went through. Because now cops know they're being watched. That there are consequences." Diane felt something crack in her chest. Not grief this time. Something else. Something that felt like validation. "I'm glad it helped," she said quietly. "It did. It does. Thank you." The woman walked away. Diane stood alone in the conference center corridor. Thought about that night at the gas station. The handcuffs. The humiliation. The grief and rage and exhaustion. Thought about Marcus Webb serving year 7 of his 17-year sentence. Thought about 127 victims who had found justice. About 87 people freed from wrongful convictions. About 600 defendants given proper representation. About 14 states that had passed reform legislation. Thought about one law student who hadn't been arrested because an officer knew he was being watched. It didn't erase what had happened. Didn't bring back the hours in that holding cell. Didn't undo the violation. But it meant something. It meant the worst moment of her life had become a catalyst for change that would outlive her. That was enough. 10 years after the gas station stop, Diane Morrison sat in her chambers at the federal courthouse. She was 61 years old. 14 years on the bench. She had presided over 2,347 cases. Issued 6,893 written opinions. Her rulings had been cited in Supreme Court decisions 7 times. She had also buried her mother. Survived being arrested. Prosecuted a corrupt officer. Won the second-largest civil rights verdict in California history. Donated $47 million to reform organizations. Established a foundation that had freed 173 wrongfully convicted people. Passed legislation in 14 states. Her chamber's wall held 3 photographs. The first, her mother Ruth Morrison on the day Diane was confirmed as a federal judge. Pride visible in every line of her face. The second, the gas station parking lot at 2:17 a.m. Diane's Honda Civic. Webb's patrol car. The moment everything changed. The third, the California State Assembly on the day the Morrison Act passed. Diane standing at the podium. Looking at a future where accountability was possible. She looked at those photographs and thought about how a single moment of prejudice could ripple outward. Could expose systematic corruption. Could trigger investigations and trials and legislation and reform. Could transform one woman's worst night into a foundation for justice. Her phone rang. Her clerk. "Judge Morrison, your 2 p.m. hearing is ready." "I'll be right there." She stood. Put on her judicial robes. Pinned the federal judiciary lapel pin to her collar. The same pin she'd worn that night at the gas station. Walked into her courtroom. Took the bench. Called the case. United States versus Martinez. Civil rights violation. Unlawful search and seizure. Let's proceed. And the work continued. Because justice wasn't a single victory. It was 1,000 small battles. 1,000 cases. 1,000 moments of choosing accountability over expedience. It was showing up every day and doing the work. That's what her mother had taught her. That's what the gas station stop had reinforced. That's what the next 10 years would require. So she did the work. And somewhere in 127 communities across California, people drove home at 2 a.m. without fear. Because one federal judge had refused to stay silent. Had turned humiliation into accountability. Had transformed a traffic stop into a movement. Sometimes justice wasn't served immediately. Sometimes it took years of documentation and trials and legislation and persistent, exhausting work. But it came. And when it did, it didn't just punish the guilty. It protected the innocent. Changed the system. Made the next generation safer. That was the real victory. Not the sentence. Not the settlement. But the change that outlasted both. If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it. And let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.